Between 1969 and the early 1970s, the Zodiac case existed across multiple jurisdictions in Northern California, handled simultaneously by local police departments, county offices, and later, state and federal agencies. From an administrative standpoint, this period is critical, not because the investigation collapsed, but because the case never crossed a legal threshold required for prosecution. It is important to state this clearly at the outset. The Zodiac file was not empty. By this stage, the record already contained confirmed victims, documented crime scenes, physical traces collected at those scenes, and formal witness statements taken close to the time of the incidents. In any conventional homicide case, these elements would normally form the foundation of a prosecutable file. However, in the Zodiac case, they did not. The reason lies not in the absence of evidence, but in how that evidence was administratively received and structured. During this period, evidence was collected by different agencies, under different procedural standards, and stored within separate record systems. There is no documentation indicating that these materials were ever consolidated into a single prosecutorial case file with a defined legal owner. In criminal law, evidence does not become prosecutorial simply by existing. It must be formally integrated into a unified legal structure, tied to a defined jurisdiction, and prepared under standards that allow it to be tested in court. That step never occurred. As a result, the Zodiac record remained what can best be described as an investigative archive, rather than a prosecutorial file. The evidence pointed toward criminal activity, but it was never positioned within a framework capable of supporting an indictment. This distinction is crucial. The failure of the Zodiac case does not begin with missing clues or investigative blindness. It begins here, between 1969 and 1971, when evidence was present, but never transformed into legally actionable proof. From this moment forward, every subsequent effort would be constrained by that original structural omission. Between 1970 and approximately 1972, the Zodiac case entered a phase that is often misunderstood. The problem was no longer whether evidence existed, but who legally controlled that evidence and for what purpose. By this period, the case file already contained several identifiable categories of material: formal witness statements, physical items recovered from crime scenes, forensic reports produced under local standards, and a growing body of administrative correspondence. Each of these elements was received through valid investigative channels. However, none of them were received under a single prosecutorial authority. Local police departments retained custody of scene-specific materials. County offices maintained victim-related records. State and federal agencies reviewed portions of the file, but without assuming legal ownership of prosecution. This fragmentation created a critical legal fault. In criminal procedure, evidence must belong to a case that belongs to someone. Without a clearly designated prosecutorial body, evidence cannot be formally evaluated for indictment, no matter how detailed or compelling it may appear. As a result, the Zodiac materials remained categorized as investigative evidence, not trial evidence. This distinction matters. Investigative evidence may guide inquiry, narrow focus, or support internal conclusions. Trial evidence must meet a higher threshold. It must be admissible, attributable, and procedurally defensible before a court. The Zodiac file never made that transition. There is no record of a consolidated prosecutorial review in which all existing evidence was formally assessed for charging viability. There is no documented decision to elevate the file from investigation to prosecution. Equally important, there is no decision rejecting prosecution. Instead, the record shows administrative continuation without legal escalation. This produced a paradox that defines the case. The evidence was sufficient to sustain investigation, but insufficiently structured to sustain prosecution. From this point forward, the Zodiac file existed in a legal limbo, actively referenced, repeatedly examined, but never owned by a body empowered to bring the case to court. After 1972, the Zodiac case encountered a barrier that investigation alone could not overcome: time. In criminal procedure, time is not neutral. It alters evidentiary value, procedural compatibility, and the ability of a court to fairly test proof. Witness statements taken near the original events gradually lost legal strength. Memory degradation, changed circumstances, and unavailable cross-examination reduced their admissibility. Statements that once guided investigators no longer satisfied courtroom standards years later. Physical evidence faced a parallel problem. Items collected under late 1960s protocols were preserved according to standards that later evolved. Without an early prosecutorial filing to anchor those items, their relevance became increasingly vulnerable to legal challenge. Courts do not judge evidence by historical intent, but by current procedural sufficiency. Equally significant, legal thresholds changed. Evidentiary rules tightened, disclosure obligations expanded, and forensic validation standards increased. Evidence gathered before these shifts could not automatically meet later requirements. Retrofitting compliance is rarely possible without compromising admissibility. Time also affected institutional continuity. Personnel changed, responsibilities transferred, and undocumented decisions faded from the record. When the rationale behind early investigative steps cannot be reconstructed, a prosecution loses its procedural narrative. Courts require not only evidence, but a defensible explanation of how that evidence arrived there. This is why reopening a case does not restore prosecutorial viability. New analysis cannot repair expired legal conditions. Technology may extract information, but it cannot recreate lost procedural context. By the mid-1970s, the Zodiac file had crossed a point of no return. It still existed as an investigative archive, but no longer functioned as a prosecutable case. Time did not erase the evidence. It removed the legal pathway required to use it. This outcome reflects structural failure, not investigative apathy, and explains why certainty alone cannot substitute for lawful procedure in historical criminal cases under modern judicial scrutiny. Beyond time itself, the Zodiac file encountered a final structural barrier that permanently disabled its prosecutorial potential: the chain of custody. In criminal law, evidence is only as strong as its documented history. Courts require a continuous, verifiable record showing who collected an item, how it was stored, who accessed it, and under what conditions at every stage. If that chain is broken, the evidence may still exist physically, but it loses its legal identity. Between 1969 and the early 1970s, Zodiac-related materials were collected by multiple local agencies, each operating under its own storage practices and documentation standards. At that time, no centralized evidence management system existed to unify custody across jurisdictions. As a result, different items entered separate custodial paths, some well-documented, others incomplete. Transfers occurred as personnel changed, departments reorganized, or materials were reclassified. In several cases, records describe possession, but not procedural continuity. From a courtroom perspective, this creates a fatal vulnerability. The defense does not need to disprove the evidence itself, only to introduce reasonable doubt about its integrity. Even the possibility of undocumented access, environmental exposure, or procedural deviation is sufficient to challenge admissibility. Importantly, modern forensic testing cannot repair this defect. Applying new technology to old evidence does not retroactively establish lawful custody. Without an intact chain, results may be scientifically valid, yet legally unusable. This is why the presence of preserved materials does not imply prosecutorial readiness. Evidence must not only survive time, it must survive scrutiny under present legal standards. By the time renewed interest emerged decades later, the Zodiac file faced an unavoidable reality. Some materials could no longer satisfy chain of custody requirements, regardless of their investigative value. This does not indicate negligence or concealment. It reflects a historical mismatch between investigative practices of the era and evidentiary expectations of modern courts. At this stage, the Zodiac case ceased to be limited by what could be discovered. It became constrained by what could be lawfully proven. By the mid to late 1970s, the Zodiac file had reached what criminal procedure defines as a point of no return. This does not mean the case was closed, abandoned, or resolved. It means the conditions required for lawful prosecution no longer existed simultaneously. At this stage, the file still contained evidence, references, and ongoing interest. What it lacked was the procedural alignment necessary to move forward. Evidence was fragmented across jurisdictions. Custody chains were incomplete. Witness testimony had aged beyond reliable courtroom use. Legal standards had evolved past the conditions under which the materials were originally collected. Criminal prosecution requires convergence. Evidence, authority, timing, and procedure must intersect within a narrow legal window. In the Zodiac case, that window closed gradually and without formal acknowledgement. This is a crucial distinction. The file was not rejected by a court. No indictment was dismissed. No ruling declared the evidence insufficient. Instead, the case remained administratively open while becoming procedurally inactive. Once this state is reached, reopening the file does not restore prosecutorial viability. Additional analysis may generate insight, but insight is not evidence. New technology may extract data, but data alone cannot reconstruct lost procedural foundations. This explains why later reviews, despite their seriousness, could not alter the outcome. They operated within a file that no longer met the minimum requirements for indictment under contemporary law. The Zodiac case therefore occupies a rare legal category, a file that persists historically but cannot progress judicially. It is not unsolved because the truth is unknowable. It is unresolved because the legal pathway to resolution was never secured in time. Understanding this distinction matters. It shifts the focus away from missing answers and toward systemic conditions. The Zodiac case endures not as a mystery to be cracked, but as a record of how procedural structure determines whether justice can be formally rendered.